Let's travel back in time together. Long before the pyramids of Egypt, long before the empires of Rome and Greece, there was Africa, the cradle of humanity. It is here, on this vast and rich continent, that our most distant ancestors took their first steps. But today, we will not simply talk about the distant past. We will follow a guiding thread, a powerful idea that spans the centuries: Pan-Africanism. This word, perhaps new to you, means the unity of all African peoples and their descendants scattered around the world. It is the idea that Africans, whether they live in Dakar, Paris, New York, or Kingston, share a common history, common struggles, and a common destiny. To understand this idea, we must travel through time. Our story begins millions of years ago, when the first humans lived in the African savannas. Then, we will traverse the great empires, such as ancient Egypt, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Zimbabwe, and many others. We will see how these brilliant civilizations were disrupted by the slave trade and colonization. We will see how Africans and their descendants resisted, organized, and forged the Pan-Africanist idea. We will talk about the Berlin Conference of 1885, where European powers divided Africa without inviting a single African. We will talk about Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, and all those who dreamed of a free and united Africa. This course is an invitation to a fascinating journey. Hold on tight, because we are going to traverse centuries of history, drama, and triumph. Pan-Africanism is not just a theory, it is the story of a continent seeking to rediscover itself, rebuild itself, and take its place in the world. It is our story, everyone's story. SEP Part 1, Origins and Great African Empires, from Origins to 1500 AD. Our journey begins a very long time ago, long before the invention of writing. Africa is often called the cradle of humanity. It is in East Africa, in the Rift Valley, that the oldest hominid fossils have been discovered. Lucy, a 3.2 million-year-old Australopithecine, was found in Ethiopia. This means that humanity's first steps were taken on African soil. For millennia, human groups dispersed, hunted, gathered, and gradually learned to cultivate the land. Around 10,000 BC, the Sahara was not the arid desert it is today. It was a green and fertile region, with lakes, rivers, and lush vegetation. People lived there, painted frescoes on rocks, and raised cattle. But around 3000 BC, the climate changed, the Sahara dried up, and populations migrated towards the Nile and West Africa. It was then that.
Why with the Kingdom of Kush, in present-day Sudan? The Kushites even conquered Egypt and ruled under the 25th dynasty, around 750 BC. Further south, the Kingdom of Aksum, in present-day Ethiopia, was a major commercial power between the 1st and 7th centuries AD. It traded with Rome, India, and Persia. But Pan-Africanism is not limited to East Africa. In West Africa, several empires succeeded each other. The Ghana Empire, which flourished between the 8th and 11th centuries, was nicknamed the Land of Gold. Its kings were immensely rich. Then came the Mali Empire, in the 13th and 14th centuries. Its most famous emperor, Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He distributed so much gold along his way that the price of gold in the Mediterranean was disrupted. The Mali Empire was renowned for its wealth, but also for its knowledge. The city of Timbuktu was a great intellectual center, with a university and libraries containing thousands of manuscripts. Later, the Songhai Empire, in the 15th and 16th centuries, was one of the largest empires in African history. It stretched over a vast region, with a centralized administration, a powerful army, and economic prosperity. In southern Africa, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, between the 11th and 15th centuries, built the Great Stone Wall of Great Zimbabwe, an impressive city. These empires were not isolated islands. They traded with each other, exchanged ideas, technologies, and goods. Africa was a dynamic, connected, and prosperous continent. But from the 15th century onwards, things were about to change dramatically. The first European explorers, initially the Portuguese, began to sail along the African coasts. Their objectives were trade, especially gold, spices, and later, tragically, human beings. Scipio Part 2, The Slave Trade, Slavery, and the Beginnings of Resistance, 1441 to 1885. The arrival of Europeans marked a tragic turning point in African history. In 1441, the Portuguese captured the first Africans to enslave them. What began as a marginal trade would transform into a monstrous system that would last over 4 centuries. The transatlantic slave trade, also called the triangular trade, is one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were torn from their homeland, crammed into ships, and forcibly transported to the Americas. Conditions were atrocious, captives were chained, packed into holds, without hygiene, with little food and water. Many died during the crossing, called the Middle Passa.
Plantations, slaves escaped, forming maroon communities, groups of fugitive slaves who lived in freedom in remote areas. There were also major revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, led by Toussaint Louverture, which resulted in the creation of the world's first independent Black republic. In Africa itself, resistance was organized. Kingdoms like Dahomey, Ashanti, and Congo resisted the European advance. Figures like Queen Zinga of Ndongo, present-day Angola, fiercely fought the Portuguese in the 17th century. Meanwhile, abolitionist movements developed in Europe and America. People like Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who wrote a poignant account of his life, helped expose the horrors of slavery. In 1807, the United Kingdom abolished the slave trade, followed by other countries. Slavery itself was gradually abolished, in 1834 in British colonies, in 1848 in French colonies, in 1865 in the United States after the Civil War. But abolition did not mean the end of oppression. Former slaves, even free, remained discriminated against, poor, and deprived of political rights. In Africa, the slave trade had weakened societies, created divisions, and paved the way for colonization. On February 26, 1885, at the Berlin Conference, European powers, Germany, Belgium, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Portugal, Spain, divided Africa among themselves, without any African participation. This event, known as the Scramble for Africa, drew arbitrary borders, cutting across peoples and cultures, and opened the way for the systematic colonization of the continent. African resistance continued, but European weapons, diseases, and internal divisions often overcame African armies. Africa had become Pre-SCP Part 3, The Birth of Pan-Africanism and the Struggle for Independence, 1900 to 1960. It was in this context of oppression that the Pan-Africanist idea emerged. The word Pan-Africanism appeared at the beginning of the 20th century, but the idea of African unity was much older. The first to formulate this idea were African and Afro-descendant intellectuals and activists. In 1900, Henry Sylvester Williams, a Trinidadian lawyer, organized the first Pan-African Conference in London. The goal was to discuss the problems of African peoples and their descendants, and to demand more rights. But the true father of modern Pan-Africanism is W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American sociologist and historian. Du Bois organized several Pan-African congresses, notably in 1919, 1921, 1923, 1927, and 1945. These congresses brought together delegates from Africa, the Caribbean.
Between Africa and the diaspora, Garvey had immense influence, even though his ideas were sometimes controversial. In the 1930s and 1940s, the Pan-Africanist movement strengthened. African intellectuals like Leopold Sédar Senghor, Senegal, Aimé Césaire, Martinique, and Frantz Fanon, Martinique, developed the concept of negritude, which values black culture and identity. World War II, 1939 to 1945, accelerated things. The colonial powers, weakened by the war, could no longer maintain their domination. African soldiers who had fought for freedom in Europe returned home with ideas of freedom and independence. In 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, organized in Manchester, United Kingdom, marked a turning point. It brought together future independence leaders, such as Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya, and Nnamdi Azikiwe, Nigeria. The Congress clearly demanded the immediate independence of African colonies. The struggle for independence intensified in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was a fervent Pan-Africanist. He believed that the independence of African countries was only a first step. The ultimate goal should be the political and economic unity of all Africa. He organized the Conference of Independent African States in 1958, and was a key player in the creation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. Other countries followed: Nigeria in 1960, Senegal in 1960, Kenya in 1963, Tanzania in 1964, etc. But decolonization did not happen without violence. In Algeria, a terrible war pitted Algerian independence fighters against France from 1954 to 1962. In the Congo, independence in 1960 was followed by a political crisis and the assassination of leader Patrice Lumumba. Despite the difficulties, the Pan-Africanist idea remained alive. The OAU, replaced by the African Union in 2002, was an expression of this desire for unity, even if its results were mixed. SEP Part 4, Pan-Africanism Today, Challenges and Perspectives, 1960s-present. Since independence, Pan-Africanism has continued to evolve. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, founded in 1963, aimed to promote unity and solidarity among African states, coordinate efforts to improve living conditions, and defend state sovereignty. But the OAU was criticized for its lack of effectiveness. It could not intervene in the internal conflicts of
Africa's development, NEPAD. In 2018, the AU launched the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, a vast single market aimed at boosting intra-African trade. Today's Pan-Africanism is not limited to politics. It is also expressed in culture, music, fashion, and sports. The concept of African Renaissance is often evoked. It is a cultural and intellectual movement that celebrates African heritage and encourages innovation. Figures like musician Fela Kuti, Nigeria, writer Chinua Achebe, Nigeria, or filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, Senegal, have helped spread a positive and complex image of Africa. But many challenges remain. The continent still faces problems of poverty, conflict, corruption, and economic dependence. The borders inherited from colonization are often sources of tension. Pan-Africanism must adapt to a globalized world, where foreign powers, China, United States, Europe, continue to strongly influence the continent. The debate is lively: should there be total political unity, United States of Africa, or more flexible cooperation? Should economic development be prioritized first? How to integrate the African diaspora? These questions are at the heart of contemporary Pan-Africanist discussions. Pan-Africanism is not a fixed idea. It is a living movement, constantly evolving. It reminds us that Africa's history is a story of resistance, creativity, and hope. And it invites us to reflect on our own place in this great narrative. SEP Deepening Pan-Africanism and the Diaspora, a Story of Connections. A crucial aspect of Pan-Africanism is the relationship between Africa and its diaspora, that is, the descendants of Africans deported by the slave trade. This diaspora is scattered around the world, in the Americas, United States, Brazil, Caribbean, etc., in Europe, and even in Asia. Pan-Africanism has always insisted that Africans in the diaspora are an integral part of the global African community. Figures like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King have all emphasized this connection. The Back to Africa movement, promoted by Garvey, encouraged some African Americans to return to Africa, notably to Liberia and Sierra Leone. However, this movement had mixed results. Today, the connections manifest in many ways. Culturally, African music, dance, fashion, and cuisine are celebrated worldwide. Jamaican reggae, American hip-hop, Brazilian samba, all have African roots. Economically, the diaspora plays an important role in investments and remittances to Africa. Politically, organizations like the National Association
Spora as the sixth region of Africa, a strong symbolic decision. But there are also tensions. Some Africans on the continent criticize the diaspora for its lack of knowledge of African realities, or for its sometimes romanticized approach. Others believe that the diaspora should first focus on its own struggles against racism and inequality in its host countries. The debate is healthy and necessary. It shows that Pan-Africanism is a complex movement, which must constantly negotiate differences in perspective, experience, and priority. Deepening this connection is essential for the future of Pan-Africanism. For it is by uniting the forces of the continent and its diaspora that Africa can fully realize its potential. SIP methods and tips for understanding and remembering. Use a timeline. Draw a large timeline with key dates. 3100 BC, Unified Egypt, 1324, Mansa Musa, 1441, beginning of the slave trade, 1885, Berlin Conference, 1900, First Pan-African Conference, 1957, Ghana's independence, 1963, creation of the OAU, 1994, end of apartheid, 2002, creation of the AU. Place these events on your timeline to visualize history. Create mind maps. For each major period, make a map with the central theme, e.g., African empires, and add branches, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, etc., with keywords, gold, Mansa Musa, Timbuktu. Associate images.